Hello, everybody, and welcome to Tax Talk, the podcast that is a broadcast of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. I'm Paige MacPherson, the Alberta Director of the CTF, and my usual co-host, Jordan, our BC Director, is away today, presenting an award to a very cool tax fighter in Prince George, BC. But I am thankfully joined by two awesome colleagues, Todd, MacKay, our Prairie Director, and Ontario Director, Christine Van Geyn. So we're going to have some good chats today about the green schemes that seem to be lurking across Canada. And I can't tell anymore if they're going west to east or east to west, but we're going to get into that and some talk about carbon taxes as well. So thanks for joining us here on Blab. And there's lots of ways for you guys to connect with us out there. So if you've joined us here live, make sure to subscribe to our feed to keep track of our shows and all of our podcasts. You can comment on the sidebar. That's just over here. I'll type here. If you want to ask us a question directly, you can write /lowercase q and then a space and then ask your question, and it'll show up in the queue, and then we can actually answer it live. You can also tweet at us. I'm at Paige McPhee, Todd is at Todd A. MacKay, and Christine is at C. Van Geyn, and we'd love to answer your questions there. If you're wondering who we are, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy group dedicated to lower taxes, less waste, and more accountable government. And that really drives all of the work that we do. All of our communications, our research, our advocacy work is driven by those three goals. So you can find out more about us by checking us out at taxpayer.com. That's our website, see what we're working on. Or if you're watching this later as a podcast or a recording, we still want to hear from you. Check out our website, or you can email us. If you email abdirector@taxpayer.com, that'll go directly to me. And you can also check out our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/taxpayer.dot.com. Okay, so let's get into the podcast today. Todd, what is new out in the prairies, other than the fact that, congratulations, you just had your first baby girl?
That's right, yeah, our fourth child, but first girl, so it's pretty exciting here. Little Rosie's doing well, and my wife Tanya's doing well as well, so that's great. But in terms of taxpayer news, a couple of things next week, actually. We've got two budgets. Both Saskatchewan and Manitoba are bringing forward their budgets, and they're going to be unusual on both sides. This will be the first budget in a long time in Saskatchewan where they're running a deficit, and that they know that they're running a deficit right from the start. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens. Premier Wall has been signaling that they're going to reduce spending and get on top of that. And so, hopefully that happens, and we'll be watching for that. But that's a very new thing in Saskatchewan. And then on the other side of the border in Manitoba, they're going to be running a deficit as well. But the new thing there is that the new Conservative government there is going to be the first government in a long time in Manitoba that is explicitly saying that running a deficit is a bad idea and that action needs to be taken to address that. So very new times, and actually in both provinces here. It's
the first time that a government is acknowledging that running a deficit is bad in Manitoba in a long time.
In a long time, yeah, since about 2009. It was amazing when they got their last bond rating downgrade. The former finance minister said, "We've got a plan and the plan is working," as they get a downgrade. I'm like, if this is the plan working, like what? That's crazy. Exactly. So, it's going to take a long time for them to dig out of the mess they're in. But the best thing to do is start on it, and that seems to be what's going to happen.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, that's good. Something to watch for. It seems like forever ago now that we had our budget in Alberta, but it's funny how they all come at different times. Okay, so Christine, I know that our What's News are kind of related, so maybe I'll say mine and then you can go into yours. So mine is about the fact that Ontario Premier Kathleen Wynne is visiting Alberta. So Alberta has been pretty much since the NDP got into government, following in the footsteps of Ontario when it comes to these sort of green schemes and deciding to get into the green corporate welfare game and get all carbon taxy. But now we're not really just following in their footsteps. We're not just hearing that, reportedly Premier Notley, our premier here in Alberta, has Ontario advisors all around her when it comes to this stuff. She actually invited the Ontario Premier here, and they're actually going to be working together. The Alberta Climate Change and Emissions Management Corp and the Ontario Centres of Excellence are joining to fight climate change. They're developing clean tech initiatives. So I'm sure that people who are listening to this can just feel the money jumping out of their wallets as they hear that those words come out of my mouth, because it sounds really expensive. But it was really interesting in the legislature when the Ontario Premier was there. So Christine, maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, so what's new in Ontario is actually what's new in Alberta. As you said, Paige, the Premier here has gone to visit your Premier, and I don't think she got the welcome that she wanted when she was in the gallery yesterday in the legislature. She was called out by members of the Wild Rose for the amount of debt that she's brought to the province of Ontario. We're going to reach $300 billion in debt in Ontario. We're the largest subnational borrower in the entire world. And the Financial Accountability Officer just found that in the next 5 years, we're going to incur another $50 billion in debt with this Premier. So I think that it was an appropriate welcome. I think that if Premier Notley wants an example of exactly how not to run a province, she has a great example there in the gallery yesterday with Premier Wynne.
Yeah, so things got heated, I guess, because there was some yelling across the floor, which is actually, it's not that uncommon in our legislature right now. We've got a lot of people in there who, it's not like your sort of old stock MLAs. It's a lot of new people across the board, completely cleaned out the legislature this last election. So there's times when things get really, really fiery and exciting. And so I guess there was some heckling going on by Wild Rose saying that that the Ontario Premier is not, like you said, like not an example to follow. But now the NDP, our infrastructure minister, Brian Mason, is saying that, you know, because, so it was actually Derek Fildebrandt, who used to work with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, is now the Wild Rose finance critic, that's the opposition party here, was yelling at Kathleen Wynne, or yelling about Kathleen Wynne to the Premier, and now our infrastructure minister is saying that it's misogyny. So what do you guys think of that? Is it misogyny because he's yelling and because Kathleen Wynne is a woman?
Well, you know, I yell about Kathleen Wynne every day. I don't think that means I hate women. I think that this Premier has done a terrible job managing our economy. And I think what Mr. Fildebrandt said yesterday in the legislature, he stated a number of facts about things that Premier Wynne has done to Ontario. He made factual statements that were accurate. And I think it was highly embarrassing for the NDP government in Alberta for having their wonderful guest, Miss Wynne, welcomed in such an unfriendly way. Mm-hmm. It was embarrassing, and now they're trying to turn it around and turn it into something else, when really the truth is they invited someone whose advice they frankly should not be taking.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the truth speaks for itself, I think, when it comes to all this green stuff, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So let's get into it. I think this is really interesting because, you know, we are seeing this sort of carbon tax tide sweep across the country, and each province is either having their hand forced by the Prime Minister saying that if you don't bring in a carbon tax, that we're going to impose it on you. Or they're, you know, like here in Alberta, deciding of their own volition to start up a carbon tax scheme that's going to be expensive. So here in this province, it's going to be, it's a $6 billion carbon tax, $3 billion going out directly in subsidies, and then the other $3 billion going to a mix of rebates for some people, some Albertans, and which is supposed to sort of make it revenue neutral, which it doesn't. And then the rest is going to be on this green corporate welfare. And that's what I'm interested in, because that's kind of where Ontario started, right, Christine? I mean, they have the carbon tax coming in and the cap and trade, but they started with the green corporate welfare quite some time ago. So how has that worked out so far in the province? Yeah,
so in Ontario, actually, it's interesting. One of the largest corporate donor to the Liberal Party is a company called Greenfield, and they're a environmental company, and they have received about $2 billion, I think, in government sort of bids and subsidies. So there's a lot of questions around that, and around the whole problem with these green schemes is that it's rife with opportunity for the political allies of the government to hand out favors. That's the whole problem with corporate welfare. Not only it distorts the economy, but it distorts it in a way that allows for this sort of corrupt behavior where politicians hand out favors to their friends and allies. And one of the things that we also saw in this province was our movement away from certain types of fossil fuels in Ontario has led to a huge reliance on wind and solar energy. And the government has managed that system here in this province so that we are paying between 2 and 3.5 times the market rate for wind and solar power. And then we have ended up with a surplus of electricity. So while we have the highest rates in North America, we also have a surplus of power. And normally when there's a big supply and there's more supply than there is demand, the prices will go down. Well, not so in Ontario. We sell and export that excess power at a huge loss, and the consumers here are left holding huge bills at the end of the day. It's very unfortunate. It's not a model that any province should emulate.
And that's directly connected to the subsidies, just to subsidizing that kind of energy, or is it, you know, blocking other kinds of energy sources, or what's the reason?
Well, so for wind and solar, it's because the government created incentive programs. So they would hand out 20-year contracts for wind and solar power generation. They would sort of create subsidies for solar producers and wind farms. And then they would hand out these contracts that pay above market value for wind and solar power, what you would pay for those forms of electricity in other more competitive jurisdictions. So in effect, that is a subsidy. It's paying well above what the market rate for this electricity is. And the result has been incredibly expensive electricity in this province, to the point where we're talking about energy poverty in Ontario, because that's a reality for a lot of people. It's heat or eat. And in the winter, you know, people are leaving their homes unheated because they can't afford to continue heating it if they are in rural areas and rely on electric home heating.
That's insane. Yeah, I remember reading that Auditor General report that showed that on-peak electricity prices were 77% higher between 2010 and 2015 in Ontario, and that's even before you've got cap and trade carbon taxes even in the mix, right? That's just because of these kinds of green energy schemes. Well, that's crazy. Okay, so that's where they started. Now, one of the things that the Premier here has talked about is the fact that it's going to create all these jobs. So yes, we're going to, you know, engage in having a cleaner economy by giving all these subsidies to these green energy companies, but it's also going to create all these jobs. And I remember a similar promise in Ontario back in maybe, well, I think it was 2009 when they introduced the Green Energy Act. So how did this pan out? I mean, do they have all these magical job creation efforts? Is Ontario a booming province now?
No, Ontario is not booming. If you visit southwestern Ontario, you will see the effect that these high electricity rates have had on the manufacturing economy in this province. Manufacturing has been absolutely decimated because you can't produce goods without using electricity. And when the electricity is so expensive you can't afford it, what are you going to do? Well, you go out of business and you lay people off. Our job growth has basically been sluggish in Ontario. It's not negative like it is in places that are in recession, like in Alberta. But you know, we are a manufacturing-based economy, and things like a carbon tax, which will increase the cost of manufacturing, are going to drive those businesses that have survived. It's going to drive them away as well. It's very unfortunate. It's a bizarre priority for this government.
Mm-hmm. I found it was so weird to me that the Premier here, Rachel Notley, would stand up with Kathleen Wynne and in a press conference and talk about all of the job creation impacts that this is going to have. And you're standing there with somebody who their track record on this is terrible. Like, I mean, this is exactly what the Liberals in Ontario promised, and this is exactly what did not happen as a result of this green corporate welfare. In Ontario, I also know that a lot of the money, the subsidies have gone towards big companies. So it's not even like they're, you know, giving it to the little guys, helping out, you know, where does the little guy come out because of these subsidies? Because most of the companies that are receiving them have revenues of over $1 billion. So
yeah, that was one of the things the Auditor General actually found in her report, was that a lot of this corporate welfare went to companies that were large companies. There was no transparency around how the corporate welfare was handed out. It was basically a pot of money that the bureaucrats would would kind of arbitrarily hand out to mostly large companies that would have gone ahead with projects regardless of the money that they received from the government. So it's really a plan that achieved nothing, and that they actually had no way of tracking whether they had achieved anything or not. They didn't even have follow-up measures in place to determine if long-term jobs were created as a result of this corporate welfare. So for her to stand up with Premier Notley and say we've created all these jobs, well, she actually doesn't even know, because they didn't even have any monitoring in place to see if the money that they arbitrarily handed out to their allies and friends actually created jobs. So she doesn't know what she's talking about.
It's funny. Like, I mean, this is exactly some of the opposition criticism, and not just Wild Rose. I mean, across the board, some of the criticism to the climate plan here is that you don't have any metrics to track whether or not this is successful. So it's funny how much this is closely mirroring Ontario, and I can't wrap my head around why you would want to mirror a system like that. Now, Todd, so this is interesting in your jurisdictions too, because it's kind of like a double whammy, right? You've got the carbon tax, which we know is harmful. And I mean, in my opinion, it's going to be really expensive. There's very little gain as far as I see it. But then you've also got, on the other side of things, this corporate welfare piece. So in Ontario, or in Alberta rather, they're not only engaging in this carbon tax, they're also engaging in all of this green corporate welfare. We obviously see the same thing happening in Ontario. So maybe you can give us an update on what's happening in your jurisdictions there in Manitoba and Saskatchewan in terms of the carbon tax, but also, I mean, have you heard any rumblings of any of this corporate welfare stuff as well?
Mm-hmm. In Manitoba, the discussion is really just starting in many ways. The new Premier, Brian Pallister, in their platform, they said they would put a price on carbon, but that's literally the amount of detail there. So what they're actually going to do, when they're going to do it, look, they've got a lot of problems in Manitoba. Some of them are very immediate, especially in terms of their deficit and their debt. So it's hard to say how fast they'll move and what they'll do on that. In Saskatchewan, obviously, the debate is somewhat more progressed. And obviously, the energy sector here is hugely important and struggling mightily with low commodity prices. Premier Wall was very strong, no carbon tax here. Recently, he's softened on that just a little bit to say no carbon tax right now. Not never, but definitely not right now. And then he actually strengthened up a little bit again in the throne speech very recently. He took a very, I would say, very thinly veiled shot at the LEAP manifesto and a lot of the thoughts there. And expressed real pride in Saskatchewan workers who produce energy, who produce our food, who produce potash and many other things that are critical around the world. And many of them are very energy intensive. It takes a lot of diesel fuel to move cattle to market. Those big combines, I mean, you can put 1,000 gallons or 1,000 liters of fuel into them. They don't harvest those massive crops by hand anymore. And so he took a very, very hard shot at people who put us down, basically, who don't respect that work and the importance of it, and got some backlash for it. He was actually, there's a petition out there that's calling him immature for taking those shots. Well, you know what? You go to a coffee shop in Rosetown or Meadow Lake or Vanguard, Saskatchewan, and tell people that they shouldn't put diesel in their tractor when they're running a 100-foot air seeder. Yeah, that's going to be an interesting conversation. Let me know if that happens. I'll buy tickets. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see what happens here. But I think one of the things, particularly Premier Wall, is sitting back and looking at what particularly Premier Notley, but also Premier Wynne, looking at the policies and how that's working out. There's the old saying, the early bird gets the worm, but it's the second mouse that gets the cheese in the trap, right? You don't always want to rush in. And I think Premier Wall is taking a look and saying, boy, we don't need to rush into this problem, especially with a fragile economy. Mm-hmm.
God, you have the best sayings, Todd. Best analogies, the best sayings. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you're right. And one of the things that I think that was aptly noted by an Edmonton Journal columnist here, Graham Thompson, he's in favor of the carbon tax, but he said that the government keeps in their press conferences almost telling people how popular these policies are. Like but they're not popular. They're almost, they have to take it upon themselves to have all of these different people behind them. They're never just speaking alone, because it's their job to convince people how popular these policies are, when in reality, you do public opinion polls, they're not popular at all. And there's, I think, a reason why the government feels insecure about this, because the policies are not well liked. Do you have that same sense in Ontario, Christine, that the policies are not popular, but the government is trying to make it seem like it's the greatest thing since sliced bread and everybody loves it?
Well, one of the things that happened here recently that's really interesting and has been extremely unpopular, there's been a huge backlash against it, and it's all linked to the same green scheme, is last week secret cabinet documents were leaked to the Globe and Mail, outlining what the government is planning on doing with the revenue that they plan on generating from the carbon tax. And it's exactly what you described as a double whammy. So they're going to be taxing basically everything and anything, from home heat to manufactured goods to the fuel you put in your car, increasing the cost of just about everything. And then the revenue that they squeeze out of us that way, they're going to actually spend in ways that will make life in Ontario more expensive. So what this plan showed was that they expect 12% of all the new cars in Ontario that will be sold will become electric vehicles. They're going to ask anyone involved in transportation, involved in the trucking or busing businesses, to convert their vehicles, perfectly functional equipment. They want them to change it to lower carbon emission equipment. They're providing some subsidies for that, but they're replacing equipment that works with new equipment that the government has mandated people have. And worst of all, the government here has proposed in this document banning natural gas for home heating. This is insane. There has been a huge revolt in Ontario as a result of this. And I'll tell you why. It's because 76% of people in this province rely on natural gas for home heating. Not only is natural gas and fossil fuels the backbone of Canada's economy, but it's one of the few ways that we have relief against the high electricity prices in this province. So we have the highest prices in North America. The difference between heating your home with natural gas and heating your home electrically is $2,000 a year. And that's just with the prices right now. And we know electricity prices in this province go up about every 3 months. And the idea that we are going to have a government that forces everyone to heat their house electrically in a cold climate, in the place with the highest electricity in North America, possibly some of the highest in the world. This is a death sentence for seniors who can't afford to pay their electricity bills as it is, and who are now going to be forced to heat their homes electrically and will probably shut off their heat. This is totally out of touch. It's going to have destructive effects, not only on people's health and lives, but on industry in this province. The government has not denied that this is part of their plan. Yesterday, Premier Wynne said, those documents, like, that's not 100% what we're going to do. But, she also said back in the day that she had no plans for a carbon tax, and the carbon tax was passed in the legislature last Wednesday. So if she's going to come out and say that this plan to ban natural gas, that's not a real plan. We saw it. We saw it in her cabinet documents that were leaked. So I think that it's a huge concern, and it has been a very unpopular proposal. And I hope that the backlash that we have had here on Ontario keeps this scheme just that. It keeps it a scheme, and then it never gets implemented.
Also, what a slap in the face to Alberta. I mean, your new sort of bestie. We got our premiers, working together to fight climate change. Part of how the Alberta NDP has tried to sell the carbon tax plan and all these green corporate welfare schemes is that, well, we can get market access and social license for getting our gas products, oil and gas products, to market across the country or internationally. And now, so we are, bending over backwards, doing all of this stuff, paying exorbitant prices, soon when it comes to the tax that we're going to pay so that we can get this stuff to market. And meanwhile, Ontario, which is a big customer for Alberta's natural gas, huge actually, is talking about banning natural gas, which I think it speaks to this. I think that the social license argument, I have trouble accepting the social license argument. I don't buy it in a lot of cases. And I think this is the perfect example. I mean, we're doing all of this stuff, backflips to make this, more palatable for people to buy this gas. And meanwhile, Ontario, this big customer, is talking about banning it. I mean, that would really not be good for Alberta's economy.
Well, the problem with the social license argument is that what's good and what's bad keeps changing.
Yeah,
so
true.
Maybe you can explain to me, I don't know when natural gas became the enemy. We actually spent 10 years in Ontario converting away from coal to natural gas and building gas plants. Well, trying to build them and then not building them and paying for them anyway. But people used to have their furnaces subsidized by the government when they converted them to natural gas furnaces. And now natural gas is bad. It's a low emission fossil fuel. I guess it's still a fossil fuel, so maybe that's why it's still the enemy now. But we spent a decade telling people natural gas was a good product and low emission, and then suddenly the government's coming out and saying, no, it's bad now, we're going to ban it. It makes absolutely no sense. So to rely on arguments like social license to say we need to do cap and trade or carbon taxes so that we have social license to sell these products, well, we don't even know what social license mean because it keeps getting redefined. It's ludicrous.
Yeah, it's a good point. I remember covering when I was a reporter in BC, and it was all anti-pipelines. Everybody hated pipelines. Pipelines were the devil. But liquefied natural gas, that is the future. That is a new sort of innovative, clean fuel. And so I mean, you're absolutely right. It does. It keeps changing, and it's hard to keep up. And that's why I think. I mean, that's one of the many reasons why I think that this, social license stuff is just not. It doesn't pan out. What about, Todd, what's your take on that? So I know you cut in and out there a little bit, but we were talking about the fact that, Ontario now talking about banning natural gas, Alberta being a big supplier of natural gas, kind of a slap in the face to Alberta's economy when we're doing backflips to gain social license to get these products to market.
Yeah, sure. And Saskatchewan's a big producer of natural gas as well. Further to that, it's really a situation of what solutions do you want? So a number of Saskatchewan's power plants are coal, widely decried as the worst form of power. So Saskatchewan's actually brought a number of new natural gas plants online. Easy to build, they're safe. Very cheap to run because of low natural gas prices, and arguably at least better for the environment. So, but if that's not good enough now, then what? We're building wind turbines as well, not terribly efficient, and even in Saskatchewan, the wind doesn't blow all the time, which is hard to believe. I grew up in probably one of the windiest places in Canada.
Pretty. Oh, all right. Technical difficulties with Todd, but that's true. I mean, you talk about, solar energy and wind energy and how these things are going to be the silver bullet, but they're not going to be the silver bullet because it's true. I mean, we have problems storing that kind of energy, and it's extremely expensive, and it's not as reliable. Do we have you back, Todd? Maybe not. So I mean, and that is an issue too, and that's just another way. I mean, it's just to your point, Christine, about the fact that you've got the carbon tax plans and whatever, but then at the same time, out of the other side of their mouth, they're putting forth all these policies that are going to make life more expensive in other ways. And
the thing with natural gas is the way the electricity sector works is you have base load power, and then you have other things that can come in and out. So when the wind isn't blowing, when the sun isn't shining, you don't have wind and solar power. So you rely on things like natural gas to make up part of that fluctuation. And now suddenly, we're saying that that's bad. And we actually had our Minister of the Environment here waxing poetic about an end to nuclear power in this province, which, you know, we've spent billions and billions of dollars upgrading and building nuclear infrastructure in this province, and it makes up the vast majority of the base load in Ontario. We are almost entirely nuclear and hydroelectric. And the idea of banning, like, or making an end to nuclear power, what we're talking about here is the deindustrialization of an entire province.
Yeah, that's crazy. Wow. Ontario is a big user of nuclear energy. I did not know they were talking about that. Just, I guess, whatever's on trend, everything's bad, right? That's definitely concerning. I mean, a question I was asked the other day by a reporter was about, well, okay, so the carbon tax is, you know, it incents a certain kind of behavior. So people are going to be incentivized to buy an electric car, maybe if they're in Ontario, or an eco-friendly car, one of those hybrids, or they're going to be incentivized to buy a new furnace, or maybe when they purchase their next home, they'll be incentivized to purchase a condo or something so they can walk to work. And my question is, I think, more basic than that. Who in Ontario and Alberta can afford to make these decisions right now? I mean, Alberta is really struggling. In Calgary, the unemployment is a big problem. Layoffs are a huge problem. People aren't thinking, okay, I'm going to upgrade to my next car. I'm going to upgrade my furnace just because I'm going to get some little rebate. I mean, no, people are you know, in a lot of cases, people are just struggling to make ends meet in general. So I think that a lot of this is hinged on the fact, or the idea, that people would have more money to spend than they actually do. And the perfect example of that is that program in Ontario where they were subsidizing these luxury cars. Maybe you can tell people about that.
Yeah. So, and this is another part of the Green Plan that was leaked last week, is that they're going to continue to subsidize these luxury supercars in Ontario. So we did a Freedom of Information request through Canadian Taxpayers Federation to see just how much money the Ontario government has spent on subsidies for electric cars. And we found that $14 million had been spent in subsidizing cars worth over $70,000. So if you can afford a $70,000 car or above, you probably don't need a subsidy from, you know, people who earn less than that in a year. We also found that there were 5 vehicles called Porsche Spiders. These are Porsche Spider 918. It's called the 918 because there were only 918 ever manufactured. It's a luxury collector's item car that costs in Canada $1.1 million. And the 5 people who bought that $1 million collector's item race car Porsche, they received $5,000 subsidies courtesy of the taxpayer. Now, instead of canceling this plan, the Premier, she has eliminated the subsidy for people who buy cars over $150,000. But you're still eligible for a subsidy if you buy a car that's $149,000.99. The government is actually putting more money into that program, about $280 million more going into these green vehicle subsidies. And they're also going to be subsidizing electric charging stations. And they want to give away free electricity at government buildings to people who want to charge their cars at, like, your local government-owned liquor store. So this is the problem with this plan, the whole problem with the idea of the carbon tax, and then at the same time the government implementing these command and control government imposed bans and regulations and incentives, is the people who argue for carbon market and cap and trade think that people will be incentivized, the way you mentioned, Paige, by either carrots or sticks to act in a certain way and change their behavior. The idea that the government in Ontario is both using these so-called market mechanisms, I dispute that it's a market at all, and at the same time using command and control mechanisms, reveals their deep distrust for markets at all, and their disbelief in their own plan that a cap and trade system will actually alter behavior. So if they really believed that, if they really believed that cap and trade would change behavior, they wouldn't need to have these command and control mechanisms. But they don't trust markets, even fake markets that they've made up themselves. So they're going to impose things like bans on natural gas and subsidies for super luxury cars for millionaire.
Yeah. Just crazy. All right, so maybe last word on the carbon taxes to you, Todd. What do you think that people in your jurisdictions should be watching out for? What are they going to be watching their governments
So
for?
to me, there's a number of key things to watch. First of all, these carbon taxes, they look a lot like cash grabs. The term revenue neutrality seems to be a pretty plastic term and seems to always break in favor of the government. So I think as Manitoba and Saskatchewan looks at these policies, I think there's going to be a lot of tough questions about that. Secondly, the fixes look worse than the disease here. So, Christine's talking about this. Look, where I grew up, it was a 20-minute drive to buy a jug of milk. I mean, that was just reality. So you hit me with a 6-7 cent a liter tax, that jug of milk got more expensive just for me to get it. And then even if you say, okay, well, we're going to have tax rebates for who? So you're taking my 6-7 cents a liter, and then you're giving it to some guy who's buying a hybrid Porsche. Yeah, we're going to have some questions about that here. We're going to have a lot of questions about that. And then lastly, what's the ultimate outcome here? I mean, if Saskatchewan stopped all of its emissions, 100% of its emissions, and the economy in China or India heats up by 1 or 2% a year, I don't think you're going to even notice the drop in the bucket that we made there. So now I'm getting hammered for picking up a jug of milk for my kids to buy some guy a Tesla, and it doesn't matter anyway because China put up a new plant. I'm not real sure that this is going to work out the way people think it is, and I think that's why, particularly Premier Wall, and I actually expect Premier Pallister in Manitoba as well, to probably move pretty slowly on this. Let's see how Premier Notley and Premier Wynne make this work before we get too far down the road with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to put that in perspective, even by the most optimistic projections by the Alberta government for their climate plan, the amount that we would reduce our emissions by 2030, after having the carbon tax for 14, 15 years, would be what in that same period, China would kick out 54 times that amount of emissions in that same period. So, and that's even, I think, with China's, green ambitions that they've sort of put into place. So yeah, it's certainly the drop in the bucket argument is an important one. All right, now that we have talked about carbon taxes and it's a little bit of doomsday, hopefully we can fight against them. That's what we're going to try and do and stop this cash grab across the country. That's what we're hoping to do at the CTF. But let me tell you about our waste of the week. So despite the fact that Calgary has entire floors of office towers sitting uninhabited now that nobody will rent because there are no jobs, despite the fact that every person you talk to in Calgary has several friends that have been laid off, and our unemployment rate really speaks for that. It's higher than it's been in quite some time. Despite all of that, the city is still spending on ridiculous public art projects. So the latest one is that they're spending $20,000 to $75,000 per project. How many projects? I don't know. And they're on bike racks that promote a stimulating cultural environment. So the bike racks have been worked into our public art budget. Funny enough, the Rebel actually broke this story, and Ezra had a funny video about how you can go online and find bike racks for like $100. we just put those ones in, but instead we have some goals and objectives that these bike racks must promote a unique and stimulating cultural environment to enhance the experience of the site for the public. They must engage people and capture the essence, personality, or history of the site, presumably these sites being the side of roads. They must provide a rich and dynamic character for the site through the creation of strong visual identity, and they must integrate with the site design and its surrounding elements. I mean, this just goes on and on and on of this proposal that request for proposals that the City of Calgary has put out, enliven the visual experience through color, texture, and content. These are bike racks. So despite the fact, like I said, that Alberta and Calgary, our economies are lagging, the city still still insists on spending on stuff that I would certainly not say is necessary. And frankly, there was a survey done by the city very recently, and an overwhelming majority of Calgarians said that they do not want to see higher taxes and spending. They want to see the government cut spending. They want to see the government scale back, and yet the government has decided that it's a necessity and that it's a priority to fund culturally stimulating bike racks. So. Oh, the Calgary art page is always good for a waste of the week.
It's weird.
Have you guys heard of this in jurisdictions? Do you guys have any culturally stimulating bike racks?
Not that I'm aware of. When I was growing up, we had some cattle, and at the time, Dad set up an electric fence that I didn't know about until I rode my bike through it. That was pretty stimulating, I gotta say. But it didn't cost $20,000. I'll tell you that right now. But that's crazy. That's crazy. And
$20,000 the base to $75,000 per project.
No, and it's infuriating because so many of these politicians and bureaucrats will say, "Oh, it's $20,000." When you look at the overall budget, what's the big deal? Here's a big deal. That's like a block's worth of property taxes. That's like a neighborhood that you could walk down that neighborhood and say, "Hey, you know what? Don't worry about your."
Yeah, but it's a good thing it's so nice and warm in Alberta,
Property
so people
taxes,
are biking all year round, right?
Yeah,
Exactly.
Crazy people.
Yeah, well, maybe we should put one of those electric fences between city council and the money pot so that they get stimulated every time they try and reach for more cash.
Exactly right.
All right, so that is our waste of the week, and that is it for this episode of Tax Talk from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. So as I mentioned before, be sure to follow Todd on Twitter at Todd A. MacKay. Be sure to follow Christine at C. Van Geyn. You can follow me on Twitter at Paige McP, and you can follow my absent pal Jordan at Jordan Bateman. And if you're watching this on Blab, be sure to give us props, subscribe to our feed. If you're listening on iTunes, please subscribe and give us a good rating. We're just in it for the ratings. That's all that we do this for. And then, of course, you can check out our website at taxpayer.com. Check out our Facebook page. Just search Canadian Taxpayers Federation. We are going to return next week with more tax talk. So be sure to find us always at taxpayer.com/tax talk. Thank you, Todd and Christine, for joining us. And have a great week, everybody.
Thanks, Paige.
Thanks a lot.